Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We will provide in this presentation a summary of key legal acts which set out the international economic sanctions against terrorism, as well as their implementation in the key world economies, those of the United States and the European Union. And more specifically, we will discuss the following points. We will first briefly describe the UN program of sanctions against terrorism, which is by far one of the most developed UN programs. Then we would discuss two key national regimes, and then we would finalize this presentation by briefly touching upon the humanitarian exemptions, which is of critical relevance to those NGOs which continue to operate in the areas subject to the control of terrorist groups. At the level of the United Nations, sanctions against terrorism are by far the most developed and the most comprehensive sanctions. Most of the designations, which at the UN level are over 700 for individuals and close to 300 for entities, would be the designations related to the sanctions against terrorism. There are several UN sanctions regimes which deal with the matter. Sometimes it's not easy to draw a line between those regimes which could be classified as regimes targeting terrorism or terrorist organizations within specific states. Somalia regime, where primarily Al-Shabaab as a structure and its members are targeted, may be one of those examples. So in this specific presentation, we discuss the terrorist UN sanctions, which started with the UN Security Council Resolution 1267, adopted in 1999 in connection with the spread of Taliban's authority in Afghanistan and neighboring regions. The resolution started with the air embargo and asset freeze of the Taliban and established the UN Sanctions Committee dealing with these type of sanctions. Following the 9/11 attack against the United States, the focus of the UN terrorist sanctions switched towards Al-Qaeda, at that time present on the territory of Taliban, and resulted in the US invasion of Afghanistan and the purported installation of a anti-Taliban government. As a result of those events, the regime at the UN level was split in two. The remaining part of the Taliban sanction regime was formed what is now known as 1988 sanctions regime with a special sanctions committee. The relevance of that split was that the UN Security Council deemed it necessary to support the democratic transition in Afghanistan at that time and engage in a more constructive dialogue with Taliban for the purpose of its reintegration in the power-sharing arrangements with the government of Afghanistan. And then a separate regime was created, which inherited the 1267 Sanctions Committee framework, and that regime primarily focused on Al-Qaeda and subsequently Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, given the crisis in the Middle East. And this remains by far the most important sanctions regime administered at the UN level. The importance of regime is such that unless any other sanctions regime, it has a special delisting procedure which is based not only on the institution of the Sanctions Committee and the applications towards the members of the Sanctions Committee for delisting, but also on a separately created institution, which exists just in the framework of the Al-Qaeda ISIS sanctions regime, which is the institution of the ombudsperson. The reason for the creation of this institution was believed to be the inadequacy of the judicial protection of the persons subject to the sanctions, and the institution of ombudsperson was believed to be a middle ground between a real judicial protection, which would allow court, for example, the International Court of Justice, to overrule the decisions of the UN Security Council, and nothing at all. The regime functions in a way that the ombudsperson has a power to recommend delisting and would typically be the first point of reference for any person who wishes to start the delisting process. The ombudsperson will conduct comprehensive interviews with this person, including visiting him or her in the country of residence, or if that country is not safe, in the third country, looking in depth into the relevant materials, and then making the recommendation to the Sanctions Committee as to the delisting. And the important feature of this process is that unless the Sanctions Committee, acting unanimously, overrules the recommendation of the ombudsperson or escalates the decision to the UN Security Council itself, the delisting of the person occurs, which is a really important and efficient mechanism available in the UN sanctions framework, specifically for those listings. And as I mentioned, the reason in part are a substantial number of persons who are subject to this sanctions regime. The European Union sanctions against terrorism largely implement the UN sanctions, but in addition to that, have some special sanctions program. As to the implementation of the UN sanctions, 2 EU regulations implement the Al-Qaeda ISIS sanctions regime, which by now has the largest number of designations. And then 1 regulation deals with the UN-based regime against Taliban, which is still in place. In addition to this, 2 separate sanctions programs exist in the European Union. 1 relates to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad organizations, and the second one is actually the regime which was instituted post 9/11 attack on the United States, and is basically, for the time being, the regime of the European Union where the most substantial number of international organizations are designated as terrorist organizations subject to the relevant restrictions. The examples will be the Tamil Tigers, for example, in Sri Lanka. So the spread of those organizations which are designated is more substantial, and it's primarily mentioning organizations rather than individuals, which makes it particularly relevant as far as the EU sanctions program is concerned. Given that we're dealing with terrorism, 2 most common sanctions, to the extent the person is designated, are asset freeze of the assets of the person or any assets which are owned or controlled by the person, or the travel ban sanctions, and typically an arms embargo is also present, being just a subpart on asset bans in reality. The US sanctions program against terrorism are much more complex, and the reason for that complexity is the intervention of various authorities at the level of Congress, the President of the United States, as well as the agencies within the US administration. Each of those bodies adopting various acts which regulate US sanctions against terrorism. Often those acts overlap with each other, and for that reason, the US program is particularly complex. Nevertheless, there are two key concepts in the US sanctions programs with respect to dealing with the issue of terrorism. One is a concept of special designated global terrorist, and the second one is a foreign terrorist organization. And these are the key labels, so to say, of designation which are relevant to understand the US sanctions program against terrorism. For the first concept, namely a specially designated global terrorist, the key authority is the President Executive Order 13224, as amended by subsequent orders, where most of the terrorist designations currently occur. The order was adopted following 9/11 attack against the United States, includes the definition of terrorist act, broadly defined as an act of violence which has a political agenda, and includes the, for example, explicit reference to secondary sanctions against foreign financial institutions which may be engaged in processing payments or other type of financial transactions for the benefit of terrorism. And a person designated under this executive order is called a special designated global terrorist, which automatically makes this person subject to the SDN type of sanctions, namely asset freeze within the United States, prohibition for the US persons to provide any funds, goods, or services, or receive any funds, goods, or services unless authorized to this type of persons. And on the OFAC list, this type of designations will be marked by SDGT type of designations. Another important concept is a foreign terrorist organization, a concept which is set in the US Immigration and Nationality Act. And the bottom line is that this label can be attached to a foreign organization which engages in terrorist activity, and this terrorist activity poses threats to the US security. So similar concept, different legal basis, and the result of this designation would be very similar to the one which we've discussed previously, namely the assets of such organization or its members within the US have to be frozen, and the US persons are prohibited to provide any kind of support to these type of organizations. So a different type of label and different type of authority, in essence, leading to the imposition of the US blocking sanctions. Here are the list of other authorities which may be relevant in connection with a further understanding of the US program against terrorism. At this moment, it would be suffice to say that most of the terrorist designations are actually made under the previous two authorities which we've just discussed. Final point which I would like to touch in this presentation is a humanitarian exemption, which is very important for NGOs or those persons which try to assist what often is a dire humanitarian crisis occurring in the areas subject to the control of the terrorist groups. Certainly, it's given the drastic consequences flowing from the breach of the anti-terrorist sanctions, the work of those persons, which is objectively difficult, becomes quasi impossible. And in the recognition of this, almost every anti-terrorist sanctions regime has a humanitarian exemption, which in general terms allows humanitarian work, subject to control that this work is really done for the benefit of the civilians and not for the benefit of the terrorists who often control the areas, which is placing a very substantial focus on the due diligence and control over the flow of the assets, of the equipment which is supplied to the region, and all the complexity that entails. Nevertheless, it's important to know that this exemption is available. Here I give standard wording from one of the European Union regulations, but other jurisdictions provide similar type of exemptions which allow humanitarian work to continue in the region. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentation.